happen to be. My name's Lauren Latour. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Climate Action Network's Climate Ambition Coordinator, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. So thank you again so much for joining us. I'd like to welcome you to the second in our 9-week, 10-part Pathways to Zero webinar series. For those of you who are joining us for the first time or for the second time, would love it if you would drop your location in the chat just so we can see where folks are joining in from. And if you are looking for French language translation and interpretation, there should be a little globe logo icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen on the right-hand side that says interpretation. And if you click on that, you should be able to hear our interpreter in French, and they will be with us throughout the entire webinar. So thank you so much to them for that service they're providing. When we first started talking about this webinar series a few months ago, it had started off as something relatively small, a short series of maybe 3 to 4 webinars to tell the stories of ground level action taking place across the Climate Action Network in Canada. And really, really quickly, we realized that if we were gonna sort of tell the story of our collective pathway to zero emissions, we needed to broaden the scope beyond just our 123 member organizations to include our allies. And then we realized that 4 weeks really wasn't going to cut it. What we hope you take from the next several weeks is the knowledge that although there is much work ahead on the road to a climate safe future, all of us who are committed to building resilient, prosperous communities are part of a vast and really multifaceted movement that's already doing the work and has been doing the work for years now. We hope not just to inspire with this series, but to inform, to open up a space for us to learn together and to learn from one another. Climate action isn't just about lobbying the government to give us the policy we need. It's about shaping the communities we live in, organize, and work in to model and practice the climate resiliency that we need. Whether that be by organizing mutual aid efforts within your community, learning how to better communicate climate realities beyond the bubble, or restoring a local watershed. With this series, we hope to bring you stories from experts and leaders, innovators and culture changers and frontline champions who work every day to put us on the path towards decarbonization while also prioritizing abundance, well-being, dignity, and of course, justice. Our conversations over the next few weeks are less sectoral, more thematic, exploring topics like Indigenous sovereignty and energy justice, cutting edge solutions, faith, and conversations like today's on complex systems change. For the full schedule, you can visit our website, climateactionnetwork.ca/pathways to zero, where you'll find details on each week, the speakers, registration links, and videos of past webinars that you might have missed. And those videos will always be there as a resource whenever you need them. Finally, jumping into today and what we're going to be talking about, climate change is often described as a wicked problem, one that's really difficult to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and changing conditions that are usually really difficult to recognize. The roots and impacts are complex and deeply interwoven with many other social justice and equity challenges. So today's chapter, exploring complex systems change, we'll dig into that complexity to unpack the theory and explore practical applications of complex systems analysis that help us confront and address climate challenges. That's a mouthful, but today's going to be great, I promise. We're going to be hearing 3 different stories from 3 different speakers from regions across Turtle Island. We have Sephora Berman, Tad Homer-Dixon, and Jack Gibbons joining us. After they speak, we're hoping to have a Q&A period. So unfortunately, as this is a webinar, we're not going to be able to have you, our participants, ask questions to our speakers directly. So what we do ask is that throughout the next hour, please write your questions in the chat. And that's where I will be harvesting and compiling those questions from to pose to our speakers over the next hour together. So make good use of the chat function over the next little bit. Before we get started with our speakers, just a really quick bit of housekeeping that we have to handle related to our translation services. We've been using Zoom's translation function, which is accessible, like I said, via the globe icon in the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window. But however, Zoom is rolling out new updates. And with that, we're realizing that some people are losing that functionality and that tool. So we need your help to evaluate whether or not this system works going forward. So what I'm going to do, or actually what Nathan is going to do, is launch a really quick poll right now. If you could fill it out regardless of whether or not you use our interpretation services, that would be great. It's entirely anonymous, so we're not going to know who's saying what. this is just going to help us in our planning and operating in the coming weeks. So the first question is, do you use our translation services? And the second question is, do you see the interpretation icon at the bottom of your webinar controls? And like I said, that'll really, really help us going forward. So thank you so much for filling that out for us. Give it a couple more minutes. I'm going to give us 30 more seconds. And again, yeah, for those of you who do need those translation services, we have Sophia and Marie Elizabeth here with us the whole hour. So click on that icon that says interpretation and you'll be able to hear them in your earbuds or in your speakers. Okie dokie, I think we're good to close that poll if Nathan hasn't done that already. Again, thank you so much for your responses. That'll really help us going forward. And I am going to get us started with our first speaker of the day, which is Sephora Berman, who's here. She is the International Program Director of Stand.Earth, and she's going to be talking with us today about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So thank you so much to Sephora. I'm going to throw it to you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And hello, everybody. I'm talking to you today from the unceded territory of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam First Nations here in Vancouver. I'm going to share my screen. Forgive me if I'm a little bit nervous because I only just realized that you've asked me to start this webinar on systems change with Tad Homer-Dixon here. And so that's really a little unknown fact. Tad was one of the profs 27 years ago who inspired me to go into this work. So exciting for me. So I thought I would, let me just see if you can see this. Well, okay, can you just see the one big, thanks, Lauren. I thought I would start this conversation based here at home in Canada on some of the challenges that we face and what led me to try and do a little bit of a systems analysis and then the creation of the fossil.
Sorry, I did just want to say, I do realize I actually do see your whole like interface right now, your next slide and the slides down at the bottom. Just.
All right, let's fix that.
Up on that myself.
Technology.
Right? Never easy.
No, no. Okay, I'm just going to try that. And I'm going to fix it, sorry. Okay, now do you see one slide?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, great. So I wanted to start here, and I'm going to go quickly through this because I think the folks on this webinar know this context. But you know, I've spent the last, I don't know, well over a decade trying to figure out how to make change on climate policy in Canada and beyond, given the climate emergency. Many of you here will know that Canada has had now 7 national climate plans, and we don't have a very good record of meeting our international greenhouse gas commitments. Right now, even with, I think, one of the strongest climate plans we've ever seen with the Pan-Canadian Climate Framework and the new Climate Accountability Act, we still have a significant challenge to meet our current Paris targets, which of course are also criticized heavily internationally for being much weaker than they should be. The targets we're currently working with are still the targets that the Harper government had proposed. So when I first started working on this, it was during the era of the Harper government. And I think a lot of us thought if we could just get people who weren't denying climate, if they understood climate policy and the climate emergency, that everything would change. And so, you know, incoming Trudeau administration, similar moment to what we're experiencing in the US right now. You know, and then I think the theory was, okay, if we need to get the information on the table on the policy proposals, and then everything will change. We need to organize so we can create political space. And all of this to say that we've made some great gains in the country for sure. And certainly we're seeing some pretty exciting news from yesterday in the US. But we still have a significant challenge in front of us. My work has focused specifically on the rising emissions and lock-in of future emissions from fossil fuel production, because it's one of the missing pieces in climate policy, not only in Canada, but around the world. So here you see that while we've made some progress in Canada on a number of different areas, oil and gas emissions are rising. And in fact, emissions from just the production of oil and gas in Canada are now the largest source of emissions and the fastest growing source of emissions. So why is this happening? I think the work by the Corporate Mapping Project is really illustrative here, and part of why we need to go to a systems approach. Because what the Corporate Mapping Project has shown, the collaboration between many universities and the Center and the CCPA, is that very powerful and well-organized corporate interests have worked for decades to secure access to oil extraction, convincing governments to stay on a fossil fuel extractive path, despite the fact that we know that 80% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere today come from 3 products: oil, gas, and coal. So the research via the Corporate Mapping Project has demonstrated, I think, what social justice and environmental advocates have long suspected, that there is a well-connected pro-oil complex at work in Canada that continues to press for extraction. And further, several professors, specifically this paper from Carroll from 2017, demonstrates that there's an interlocking board of directors and executives, presidents, and CEOs employed by several corporations, connecting the companies to each other over a range of sectors, and then connecting them into opinion leading elite in Canada, both in the financial and political sectors. So what's the result of all of this? Even though revenues from oil to governments in Canada have gone down, production has gone up, and yet jobs have gone down. So we're actually receiving less. And at the same time, taxpayer money to the oil and gas industry has skyrocketed. Canada is now funds the exploration, production, refining, and transport of fossil fuels more than almost any other country in the world. And so all of this led me and a group of academics and advocates from around the world to start doing some of a systems analysis to try and figure out how do we shift this dynamic? How do we get to a point where there is less influence, where we're actually seeing solutions at the scale of the problem in the time frame that we need? We started exploring linkages between countries, both in terms of this influence of the fossil fuel industry, but also trying to understand complex issues around norms that have been created around fossil fuels, how different strategies like finance strategies and changes in policy environments were interacting with each other, et cetera, and what was missing. In the end of a 2-year analysis, we created this project, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. We believe that the impacts of this project is a more systems level strategy that will unify and amplify many other efforts around the world. The need that we need to constrain production to not build more of the problem, and that we're going to have international cooperation to do that, isn't new to civil society. The Keep It in the Ground movements, led in many places by Indigenous leaders from around the world, have been extremely active for the last decade. I think the first protest on Keystone that I was at was probably 9 or 10 years ago. But we haven't seen this in policy, and we certainly haven't seen it in international agreements, and we haven't seen it in our own climate plans. There's a real disconnect between demand side climate policy, countries believing that they have to reduce emissions, and the fact that industry is on track right now to build 120% more fossil fuels than the world can safely burn. So the idea behind the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is to address this gap. A lot of people don't realize that the Paris Agreement doesn't even mention the words coal, oil, or gas, or fossil fuels for that matter. It's been successfully scrubbed out, as have almost any measure to actually constrain production or the supply side of the fossil fuel and climate problem. So when I started doing this research, I realized that the struggle we were having in Canada to address this issue was identical to the struggle that we're seeing in Norway, that we're seeing in the UK, in many countries around the world. And that, in fact, neither subnational or national governments really feel like it's their job to constrain the production and expansion of fossil fuels in the climate era, in part because we won't be competitive, in part because the theory was we're going to reduce demand, we're going to increase the price on carbon, and the markets will decide who gets to produce and how much. So there's a whole bunch of problems with that theory we've now found 30 years into the climate policy debates, which is that, well, it's not working. It's not working fast enough to keep us safe because we distort the markets through those billions of dollars of subsidies. And the price of carbon hasn't increased fast enough to constrain production, and demand has not gone down fast enough to keep us safe. So we based the idea of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty as around creating a new conversation on fossil fuels and what we do with fossil fuels, who gets to produce them, for how much, and for how long, but also connected to an analysis from our systems theory thinking that says that what's critical is to change the way that fossil fuels are perceived. For decades, we've grown up with the idea that it's about progress, that it's about prosperity, and growth of production is absolutely critical for our prosperity and progress. So the World Economic Forum every year puts out a report that assesses what are the greatest threats to the world. And for many years, that report showed that the weapons of mass destruction would have the greatest impact on the Earth as a shared security threat, and also the greatest likelihood. Today, and in fact, for the last 3 years, failure to act on climate change, extreme weather, biodiversity loss, etc., are now the most likely threats to global security and will have the greatest impact. And so we've seen this shift. Well, when the world thought that weapons of mass destruction was the greatest threat to the world, we came together and created treaties and agreements in order to constrain the stockpiling of those weapons. Today, we know that the greatest threat to the world is failure to mitigate climate change, and that we're currently producing about 120% more oil, gas, and coal than the world can safely burn. In fact, we already have enough oil, gas, and coal underdeveloped reserves to take us to 2 degrees, well beyond 1.5 degrees. So that means enough actually under construction or under production. So what that means is any new project threatens security. Any new project doesn't fit. In fact, this year's United Nations Environment Programme Production Gap Report showed that we're going to need a 6% decline per year of production of fossil fuels if we're going to meet Paris goals. So this isn't to say that we don't need the Paris Agreement, it's that we need a complementary treaty to constrain immediately the expansion of fossil fuels and to negotiate that process so that we can meet the Paris Accord. So one of the reasons we need an international approach is equity. If the markets decides who gets to produce fossil fuels and where, then equity is not taken into consideration at all. And certainly there are some countries in the world that are going to have a much harder chance, a much harder task to phase out the production of fossil fuels. So part of what we're looking for at first is equity principles for production decline. We're doing political economy scans globally to understand how difficult it's going to be for each country, and then to kind of lump and split the countries. In some circumstances, we're finding that even if countries have good policies on indigenous rights or climate or biodiversity and good goals to achieve the Paris Accord, they're pushing new oil drilling, like in Ecuador in the heart of the Amazon, just to feed their debt. And so a real global just transition requires international cooperation and negotiations in order to help nations create the right circumstances to constrain fossil fuel production. So much of this design of this initiative is based on learnings from both nuclear weapons as well as landmines and other treaties. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative is framed around 3 pillars: non-proliferation, so ending fossil fuel expansion; disarmament, phasing out production; And then the peaceful transition, fast tracking clean energy and a just transition. Our work right now focuses around these pieces, starting to create conversations between countries, so bilateral and multilateral conversations, and lump and split the countries into clubs, so that there is an active conversation around constraining production of fossil fuels. We've started creating a global registry of fossil fuel production, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. And we're working towards a global commission on fossil fuels, and we're simultaneously creating a broad public campaign, we hope, that will expand around the world. So our first initiative is the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels, because the first part of constraining any threatening product is to understand what to have accountability and transparency around who is stockpiling it. Right now, the only people who really understand how much we're producing of fossil fuels and where are the industry. So the United Nations collects emissions data from every country, but not production data. And many of the countries that we're talking to don't actually even really fully understand how much is planned to be produced in their countries over what period and for how long. And so we brought together academics and analysts from around the world, created a framework for a global registry of fossil fuels. We're now working on creating the prototype for that. And we hope that many countries will support the development of it, and it will eventually be taken over as a project of the United Nations Environmental Program. Okay, so who's the we and what do we do? We have a core steering committee that's made up of folks from around the world that come from advocacy and academics, and also diplomats and former diplomats who have worked on UN treaties before. We've created regional hubs for the work around the world in most continents of the world now. Started a political process of diplomatic engagement with governments. We have a comprehensive research project that I've talked about before. And we're starting to create the campaigns and communications. Okay, so in sum, our work is to change the narrative of fossil fuels, to provide a missing framework and mechanism for constraining fossil fuel production, to grow the global fossil fuel phase out movement. And we're starting with motivating cities and states to engage with us. We now have groups around the world who have started to endorse the treaty. And already the city of Vancouver became the first city in the world to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And just last week, Barcelona became the first city in Europe. Motions are currently being considered in New York and LA, and several other cities are beginning. The treaty is starting to get some press from around the world and response from governments. Endorsements are growing online with key partners and individuals. And we've launched just recently a campaign hub where groups from around the world are joining up and finding the resources that they need to run their own campaigns, calling on their own cities, states, provinces, or governments to join the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. Whew, so that's a global initiative, and why we're doing it, how it relates to systems theory in 15 minutes. Thanks.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Sephora. The problem with webinars and not being in person is that, like, I don't know, applauding doesn't mean as much. It doesn't sound as good, but that was truly fantastic. Thank you so much. Again, just a reminder for folks to put questions in the chat. Sephora, I think there's only one right now, just specifically about Canada in a graphic that you showed about difficulty phasing out fossil fuel production. So there's that in the chat if you want to address that. But other than that, I would invite folks to put their questions so we can pull from them later on in the program if we have time. For now, I think I am going to throw it to Jack. You are next up in our speakers list. Jack Gibbons is joining us from the Clean Air Alliance. He's the chair of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance and the director of Pollution Probe's energy program. So I will throw it to you, Jack, to take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm glad to be here. I just want to point out that I no longer work for Pollution Probe. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk to you about our campaign to phase out Ontario's 5 dirty coal plants. When we launched the campaign in 1997, all the sophisticated people in Ontario thought we didn't have a chance. they thought there was absolutely no way that we could persuade the government of Ontario to phase out 5 dirty coal plants. And it was not surprising they thought that, because we were engaged in a David and Goliath battle. As I said, we were established in 1997. When we were established, we only had 2 staff people. They were both part-time, and our initial funding was a mere $20,000 grant from the Toronto Atmospheric Fund. And when we started, we faced a lot of challenges to phase out the coal-fired power plants. First, we were up against the old Ontario Hydro, which owned the 5 coal plants. And back in 1997, the old Ontario Hydro was one of the largest electric utilities in the world, and it was one of the largest corporations in Canada. And it had no desire to phase out the coal-fired power plants. Second, when we started, coal was providing Ontario with 25% of its electricity, and we wanted to phase it all out. And third, when we started, the majority of people in Ontario didn't even know that there were dirty coal-fired power plants in Ontario. And they certainly didn't know that on Lake Erie, on the north shore of Lake Erie in Ontario, there was a Nanticoke coal-fired power plant, which was the largest coal-fired power plant in the world and Canada's #1 air polluter. The majority of people didn't know that. And the fourth challenge we were up against was back in 1997, Mike Harris was Premier of Ontario. And, environmentalists considered him to be the great Satan. And they certainly didn't think that Mike Harris would have any desire to phase out 5 dirty coal-fired power plants. So that was the challenge. We had a David and Goliath battle, but the sophisticated people didn't think we had a chance. They thought we were well-meaning, but politically naive. But we did win it, and we won it very quickly. Just 4 years after we were established, the Mike Harris government issued a legally binding regulation requiring the phase out of the Lakeview coal-fired power plant in Mississauga. And in 2002, just 5 years after we were established, the then Premier of Ontario, Ernie Eves, his government committed Ontario to a complete coal phase out by 2015. So how did we turn this around? How did we achieve a commitment to a complete coal phase out in just 5 years? Well, there are 6 basic reasons for our success. First, we had a simple message. Second, we were addressing a really important political issue. Third, we had a pragmatic solution. Fourth, we were a credible messenger. Fifth, we built up a broad level of public support for our campaign. And sixth, we were persistent. So let's deal with them one by one. First, the clear message. We had a very clear message. Coal is dirty and it's got to go. Coal kills 668 people a year in Ontario. Coal is causing your children's asthma attacks. The Lakeview coal plant in Mississauga is the #1 air polluter in the GTA, and the Nanticoke coal-fired power plant is the #1 air polluter in all of Canada. So very simple and clear messages. So that's the first reason we were successful. Clear message, we identified the evil and what had to be done with it, phase it out. The second reason that we were successful was that we were dealing with a very important political issue. Now in Ontario, in Southern Ontario, we have had smog days for like 100 years. And for years, environmentalists had been saying that was a problem. But the politicians could ignore the environmentalists when they said that smog kills and we need to reduce smog. But everything changed on May 12th, 1998, because on that day, the Ontario Medical Association, that represents all of Ontario's doctors. They held this really important press conference in a hotel in downtown Toronto, and all the media were there, including dozens and dozens of cameras. And at the press conference, the president of the OMA declared that air pollution is a public health crisis in Ontario, and that smog kills. Now, if we had said that, no one would have paid attention. But this is the president of the OMA, and no politician, and certainly not the old Ontario Hydro or Ontario Power Generation as it became, would dare attack the Ontario Medical Association. So that was the message. We have an air pollution public health crisis. And so the politicians had to deal with it. They had to have a solution. And the OMA, while they identified there was a public health crisis, they didn't say what the solution was. They're doctors. They're not people who are energy experts or experts on how to actually reduce air pollution. So that's where we came in, because we had the pragmatic solution. We had the pragmatic solution of how the government could deal with this, solve this air pollution public health crisis. And it was by simply phasing out the 5 dirty coal-fired power plants. Back then, they were producing as much air pollution as 7 million cars. And we had a very pragmatic solution. We said, switch to gas. Now, gas is a fossil fuel. It's far from perfect. But if you switch from very dirty coal to gas, you get a dramatic reduction in air pollution. And it's a transition option to allow the coal phase out as quickly as possible. A temporary transition option. So that was our proposal. And not only do we say that's how you can reduce air pollution quickly and dramatically, but we costed it out. We hired a good economist, and we got actually the old Ontario Hydro to cooperate with us on our study about how much it would cost. And this economist did the analysis with Ontario Hydro's own data and said, look, we could cost it out for a cost of only $1.86 a month for the typical residential hydro customer. So that's the cost of a cup of coffee and a donut. That's back then. That was the cost of a cup of coffee and a donut at Tim Hortons. And so here we had the solution. Huge reduction in air pollution, very low cost, no lifestyle changes. It was a perfect solution for the politicians. So we had a pragmatic solution. And now the fourth reason why we were successful is we were a credible messenger. Now, when you're calling for the phase out of 25% of the electricity supply, you have to be credible. You have to make people believe that that's something you can do without the lights going out. And so whenever I would speak to politicians or civil servants or the public or the media, I would be always dressed up in a tie and a jacket so that I looked like a very respectable bourgeois economist, not a crazed environmentalist. And that's really key of how you present yourself visually. And our credibility got a huge boost when the mayor of Mississauga, Hazel McCallion, she joined me for a press conference outside the Lakeview coal-fired power plant in Mississauga. And she called for the shutting down of that coal-fired power plant to protect the health of her residents, the people of Mississauga. And the next day, there was this huge picture in the Toronto Star with me and Hazel McCallion and the 4 smokestacks in the background. And when people saw that picture, they said, well, if Hazel McCallion supports a request by the Ontario Clean Air Alliance to phase out coal, then it must make sense. So she gave our campaign huge credibility and a huge boost. But again, when you're up against a very large corporation like Ontario Hydro and their very powerful union, you can't win just on the basis of pure reason. You have to build public support. And so we did that. We built public support to show the politicians that the public supported us. So what we did was we built the Ontario Clean Air Alliance into a huge coalition of over 90 organizations that represented more than 6 million Ontarians. And it wasn't just the usual suspects of environmental groups, but we had the City of Toronto was a member, and 10 other municipalities. And we had hydro utilities, and we had unions, and we had health organizations and faith communities. So we had a broad coalition. We showed there was a very broad coalition of support for the coal phase out. And of course, we spoke to the media, and we produced hundreds of thousands of pamphlets talking about dirty coal and how how we need to phase it out. And also, this was back, we started out back in 1997 when the internet was new, and we built up this huge email address list so we could contact our supporters and get them to email the Premier of Ontario or the leader of the opposition and call them to phase out coal. And it was very, very effective. I mean, one time we put out an email criticizing the leader of the opposition for something he did. 2 hours later, he phoned me at my home to complain about our email bulletin. So they worked. We got the message out and built the public support and persuaded the politicians they had to phase out coal. And the final reason why we were successful is we were persistent. We worked on this campaign for every single day for 17 years until the last coal-fired power plant was shut down. And persistence is really important because on a superficial level, we won the campaign way back in 2002 or 2003. In 2002, the Ernie Eves government committed Ontario to a complete coal phase out by 2015. In 2003, Dalton McGuinty was elected Premier of Ontario on a promise to phase out the coal plants by 2007. So you might think we could have just retired and everything would have worked out. But that certainly wasn't the case because though we had strong public support, there were very powerful special interest groups that did not want to see the dirty coal plants phased out. They were Ontario Hydro. They were Ontario Hydro's employees union, the Power Workers Union. They were the Association of Major Power Consuming Companies of Ontario, and the actual Ontario energy bureaucrats. None of those groups wanted to see the coal plants phased out, and they did their best to try to stop it. They slowed it down, and we had some reversals. But because we were on it, it actually did happen. So like McGuinty was elected in 2003 on a promise to phase them out by 2007. In 2005, he broke his promise to phase them out by 2007. He said, I'm going to do it by 2009. And we said, that's okay because 2009 was a more realistic date. But then in 2006, he broke his promise to phase them out in 2009. And he just walked away from his promise. He said, I can't do it by 2009. And he didn't give any date of when he would actually ever do it. So this was a huge betrayal, and we fought back really hard. And a few months after he broke his promise, there was a by-election in a riding that in the previous election was won by the Liberal Party by more than 60% of the vote. And we just went after him in that by-election and about his broken promise and about the need to phase out the Nanticoke coal-fired power plant by 2009. And as a result, the Liberal candidate was defeated. A candidate who supported the phase out of Nanticoke by 2009 was elected. And so we put incredible pressure on McGuinty to live up to his promise. And as a result, by August of the next year in 2007, he issued legally binding regulations requiring the complete phase out of the coal plants by December 2014. But even then,
Sorry, you'd asked me to let you know when you have about a minute left.
Yeah.
And actually, there was a question in the chat just about sort of acknowledging the work of sort of like other, I think the phrase you used was crazy environmentalists. And I think maybe I'm kind of curious about that myself. Would love to hear about, you talked a lot about sort of this broad coalition that was brought together around the coal phase out. And if just in like the last minute, you could maybe elaborate on that a little bit more about the coalition work you did and that sort of movement ecology and bringing all those forces together and how those worked in coordination. That would be really cool.
Well, yeah, so it was a coalition of over 90 organizations, and we certainly had many environmental groups as members. For example, Environmental Defense, Pollution Probe, the World Wildlife Fund. So there were many environmental groups, but the point I was trying to make was that our coalition was much broader than just environmental groups, that we had lots of non-traditional allies. For example, like hydro utilities. Toronto Hydro, the largest municipal utility in Ontario that supplied 20% of the province's electricity, it was a member of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. So that was a non-traditional ally for an environmental group.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for your comments today. That was fantastic. I think I'm gonna have to go right to Tad to close us out with our last 15 minutes. Again, just reminding our attendees to put any questions you have in either the Q&A or the chat function so our speakers can address those, because I think we are going to run out the clock with Tad. So I'm going to throw it over to you to get started. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Lauren. That's terrific and wonderful to hear from both Jack and Sephora, to be on this panel with them. I am acutely aware of the time. I'm going to try to condense my presentation a little bit so that we can maybe have an opportunity to answer one question or two, but let's see how it goes. I think both Jack and Sephora illustrated the power of complexity. So here on the west coast of Canada, on Vancouver Island, and I should say that I'm speaking from the territories of the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations here in Metchosin on Vancouver Island. We have set up a new institute called the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University that looks at how we might be able to exploit the opportunities inherent in complex systems by finding leverage points that can take advantage of the inherent nonlinearity of complex systems to try to accelerate change. And I think Jack really provided us with a wonderful example of how a leverage point was exploited at a particularly crucial moment in the 1990s and into the 2000s to phase out coal power in Ontario, which is an extraordinary accomplishment. And then Sephora is proposing an opportunity for exploiting leverage at both the national and international levels using a previous template of a particular kind of treaty regime to try to accelerate the phase out of fossil fuels globally. So in the Cascade Institute here, we're trying to identify these unseen leverage opportunities that could make change happen much faster. Now, I thought today I would try to condense a very long lecture on complex systems into just 15 minutes, and now I think I'm down to about 8. So it's going to be tough. But
please don't feel the need to rush too much.
Yeah, but that's fine. I understand that people want to say things. So I wanted to highlight 4 key concepts that complex systems folks use. I'm a complexity guy. Complex system science is at the core of what we do at the Cascade Institute. Complex systems, the climate is a quintessential complex system. The social environments, the biophysical environments within which we operate are all complex systems. But what does that really mean? Lots of people talk about complexity, but there sometimes is not a really full understanding of what people are talking about when they use the word. So I thought I'd highlight 4 concepts, and I'll try to go through these quite quickly with just a couple of minutes each. They are nonlinearity, feedbacks, critical transitions, and then the one that sounds most technical or sciencey is hysteresis. So let me say just a few words about each of these. And remember, each of these concepts can apply to social systems, to biophysical systems, biological systems, but I'm really going to talk about them in the context of the climate. itself, because the climate is as I say, a quintessentially, the ocean atmospheric systems are quintessentially complex. And I think we often forget exactly what makes this a wicked problem, as Lauren talked about at the beginning. What are the characteristics of climate change that make it just so impossibly, almost impossibly difficult to address? So this first concept, just nonlinearity, you hear people talk about nonlinearity. It sounds fancy, but it basically means disproportionate causation, which is also a fancy way of saying that sometimes small things or small changes can make a really big difference. And other times, for no apparent reason, really big changes in a system don't seem to do very much at all. So with a non-complex system, like say a mechanical clock, one of those wind-up clocks that we used to have around, you wind it a little bit, it runs for a certain period of time. You wind it a bit more, you wind it twice as much, it runs for twice as long. So there's kind of a proportionality between cause and effect. The amount you wind it determines the period of time it runs for. With complex systems, you get a breakdown in that relationship. So small things can make a really big difference. They can produce tipping events, and sometimes big things don't seem to make much difference at all. There's a lot of lag or inertia in the system. So let me talk in the climate, for instance. One of the remarkable things about the climate system is the disproportionality of the change we're making in the atmosphere to the actual consequence for our climate. And most people don't realize that in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we've changed the concentration from about 1 in 4,000 parts, 1/4,000, to somewhere we're approaching 1 in 2,000 parts. So as carbon dioxide as a constituent of the atmosphere is a very, very small constituent of the atmosphere, but it has a huge effect. It has a huge effect because it just happens to absorb infrared radiation radiation in exactly the part of the spectrum where otherwise that radiation would escape to space. So it happens to be very powerful because of its characteristics as atoms in the atmosphere, as molecules in the atmosphere. And the result is that we're kind of closing the windows that would otherwise allow heat radiation to escape to space. By putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we're kind of closing the windows that would allow that heat radiation to escape into space. You have a certain amount coming in from the sun, hitting the Earth, becoming transformed into heat radiation, and it can't get out as easily into space. And that produces an imbalance in the radiative balance between the incoming radiation and the outgoing radiation. It doesn't sound like a lot. It's about 0.7 watts per square meter on the surface of the planet. But here's the punchline. When you add that up across all the surface of the planet, it amounts to the equivalent of 400,000 to 500,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs a day of extra energy released into the atmosphere and the climate system of the planet. 400,000 to 500,000 Hiroshima, 15 kiloton atomic bombs of energy released into the atmosphere every day. It's an enormous shift from what appears to be a very small factor in the atmosphere, an enormous shift in the radiative balance of the planet. But here we go. That enormous shift for a long time didn't seem to make very much difference because all that heat, or a very large fraction of that heat, was being absorbed in the oceans and was being used to melt ice around the planet, glaciers, Greenland and Antarctica, and on our mountains. And so that heat didn't seem to have much effect. And one of the really difficult things about climate change is that even though this small change in the atmosphere is having such a big impact on the radiative characteristics of the atmosphere and the heat balance of the planet, it hasn't seemed to have produced the really obvious effects until recently with things like wildfires, the really obvious effects that would have motivated people. And it's interesting that Jack, to get them to shut down the coal-fired plants, pointed to things that really affected people immediately, which is their health, their asthma, their sickness. Coal plants make you sick, they kill you. With climate change until recently, we haven't been able to really point to those effects because there's been so much lag in the system and so much of the heat has been absorbed into oceans and into melting ice that it hasn't really produced a huge effect. Now we're starting to see that change, but it's one of the things, the nonlinearities in these systems, one of the things that makes climate change very difficult to address. feedbacks. So nonlinearities come from feedbacks to a very significant extent. These are causal loops where a change in the system produces a series of other changes that can either reinforce the original change or counteract the original change. If the original change is reinforced, it's called a positive feedback. If the original change is counteracted, it's called a negative feedback. Lots of examples we're familiar with from climate change and climate science. We have what's called the ice albedo feedback in the Arctic, where melting ice opens up ocean water, absorbs more heat, that causes more melting ice in the Arctic. Greater heat melts the permafrost, that releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that carbon dioxide encourages more global warming. Those would be two examples of positive feedbacks. A negative feedback would be a situation where you get a lot of melting ice and there's more carbon dioxide absorbed into the ocean. So that reduces the carbon dioxide concentration. For a long time in climate science, there's been a big debate about whether the negative feedbacks or the positive feedbacks were dominant, whether there were more self-reinforcing feedbacks that could cause the climate to sort of spiral out of control, or whether the negative feedbacks would counteract those. I think the science in the last decade or so has largely settled the matter that the positive feedbacks are dominant, and that there is a real risk of us getting to a situation where global warming can become its own cause, where carbon dioxide will cause warming that releases more carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. And that we could somewhere in here be on the cusp of what we would call a hothouse Earth, a flip into another situation where you get some kind of a runaway warming consequence. So that leads to the third concept, which is critical transitions. Complex systems, whether you're talking about social systems, economies, or the climate, have this capacity to reorganize themselves wholesale all of a sudden. The system reorganization we saw, for instance, with the cod fishery on the East Coast when it collapsed in the early 1990s. People thought, well, we'll just reduce the fishing and the cod fishery will bounce back to where it was before. But the system reorganized itself. Predator-prey relations and other ecological relations reorganized themselves, and the cod haven't come back, despite the fact that there's been greatly reduced fishing pressure. What we have to recognize with the climate is that these critical transitions, and that's the third concept, critical transitions. These critical transitions are inherent in complex systems, their capacity to flip from one equilibrium or from one stable state to another. And we don't really know where those cliff edges are. There's a lot of talk within climate science right now about the possibility that there could be connections between these flips, that you could get a flip in the Arctic system that leads to a flip in the circulation of the North Atlantic currents that then changes the climate regime for instance, the Amazon, and produces massive fires in the Amazon. This is very scary stuff. It's not widely recognized by the public, but it's something that we need to communicate because the situation is really much more critical than most people recognize, even people operating or acting within the climate activist communities. So this leads me to the fourth concept, and that's hysteresis. And that simply means that these changes are not easily reversible. You can't go back to where you were by simply reversing the process that got you to where you are. In other words, once we flip the climate into a new state, even if we reduce the carbon dioxide below the level that flipped us into that new state, the climate won't go back to where it was. So there's a huge premium on precaution, on trying to get ahead of this problem and making sure we don't get into a situation where we have a critical transition driven by feedbacks that actually causes us to move into a new circumstance where ocean currents reorganize themselves, atmospheric circulation patterns reorganize themselves so that the world is in a much less livable place. So those are the four concepts: nonlinearity, feedbacks, critical transitions, and hysteresis, that we find, among others, are very, very useful in trying to understand how complex systems work. And each one of them relates to just how wicked and difficult this climate problem is. And I think for all of us working in this business, we need to try as much as possible to communicate the seriousness of this situation and its wickedness to the public, so that they understand that the time to act is now, rather than waiting until things get really bad when we actually can reverse the situation. That leaves us 2 minutes for questions.
That leaves us 2 minutes for questions. You'll see there's a couple questions for you specifically, Tad, in the Q&A box. I think there might be one in the chat as well. Oh gosh. Okay. Unfortunately, we really only have 1 minute left, so I don't actually have time. I was gonna ask everybody a question about sort of what in their mind, like the key tipping point or leverage point was. You talked, Tad, about sort of exploiting those tipping point opportunities within complex systems, and that was going to be the question I was going to pose to people.
Well, let me say one thing. I've got 30 seconds.
Yeah,
okay,
please.
One thing. So let's take these ideas and see, Sephora and Jack have both talked about using these leverage points, but one that we're working on within the Cascade Institute right now is with normative shifts within pension funds. Pension fund managers and directors, the communities of people who control tens of trillions of dollars in investment on the planet. There are about 2,000 people on the planet who control this money. And to the extent that you can actually shift their understanding on climate change by, for instance, communicating some of those things I was just talking about, so that they recognize the urgency of the situation, it could produce a huge redirection of funding to support renewable energy investment. So there's an example of a leverage point using complex system thinking that we're trying to focus on right now.
Awesome, thank you. And Sephora, I saw that you have unmuted yourself. If you want to jump in there really quick.
No, I think it's great for Tad to have that last word. The term leverage point is what I was trying to think of this morning when I was trying to explain why we're focusing in part on the shifting the social norm of fossil fuels, and specifically why we're working so hard to get cities to endorse, because of the history of cities coming together and playing a role, and they're less influenced by the fossil fuel industry. So this idea of doing some kind of system scoping or analysis to find those leverage points, for me as an activist trying to figure out what makes social change for the last 30 years, is super exciting and has created some new ideas.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you all so much for bringing your thoughts and bringing your ideas and your fantastic work to us today. It was so valuable to learn from you. And thank you so much to all of our participants for joining in and listening and learning today. As all of you know, this is one webinar in a 10-part series. We have our labor transitions conversation happening next week. So registration for that is open at our website, climateactionnetwork.ca/pathways-to-zero. Yeah, huge thank you to everybody for joining and continuing this conversation with us. So
Thank you.
Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Bye.